I'm Sue O'Connell. Tonight on Greater Boston, activists and protesters are demanding change after the death of Tyre Nichols at the hands of Memphis police. We'll take a look at where police reform stands now and what more needs to be done. Plus, the world's longest scientific study of its kind finally has an answer to the age-old question: what makes us happy? It was a weekend of protests across the country, including here in Boston, with renewed calls for widespread police reform after the Memphis Police Department released the footage of several of its officers brutally beating Tyre Nichols, who died from his injuries a few days later.
Say his name! Tyre Nichols! Say his name! Tyre Nichols! Justice for Tyre Nichols!
In the week since his death on January 10th, 5 Memphis officers were fired by the department, and last week they were all charged with second-degree murder. The city has also disbanded the so-called Scorpion unit that they were a part of, which was created to target high-crime areas. And today, a 6th officer has been placed on leave in connection with Nichols' death. Now, activists, protesters, and the head of the Tennessee chapter of the NAACP are calling for national reforms to prevent police brutality like this from happening in the first place.
We come to call to action for Congress. By failing to craft and pass bills to stop police brutality, you're writing another black man's obituary. The blood of Black America is on your hand, so stand up and do something.
Joining me to discuss the status of police reform in this country are Professor Jody David Armour, a law professor at the University of Southern California, who studies the intersection of race and legal decision-making, and Rahsaan Hall, former director for the Racial Justice Program at the ACLU of Massachusetts, the 2022 Democratic nominee for Plymouth County District Attorney, and now the founder and principal of Rahsaan Hall Consulting. Welcome to both of you. Rahsaan, I want to start with you first. I had a conversation today with some law enforcement people in the area in Massachusetts, asking to kind of confirm my opinion of watching that terrible tape of the murder over the weekend. And to me, it violated a number of basic police protocols, one of which would be to call for a supervisor and to slow things down when something like that is getting out of hand. Yet here we are discussing how we can have nationwide federal reforms when on such a basic level so many violations occurred that resulted in this murder. What's your take on what has to happen here?
Well, part of the problem with the conversation about reform is that there have been reforms. There was recent reform in 2020 in Memphis that required de-escalation and intervention, and we still find an incident like this. And so the real root of the problem is the nature of policing itself. Yes, you can have as much training as you want, but until the ideologies that informed how policing happens, particularly how race filters into it, we're going to continue to see these types of incidents occurring throughout the country. And I think that's why there have been calls for defunding the police. That's why there has been a movement towards abolition, because people believe that with this type of policing, we never get to the underlying causes and root causes or underlying issues that require people to call the police in the first place.
Professor Armour, as a woman and as a lesbian, and as someone who has fought for representation at tables, to be in the room when things are happening, to help to decrease misogyny, decrease homophobia, I'm also distinctly aware that just being there is not necessarily going to change those things overnight, and sometimes the reverse happens. And the challenge here as well for some watching this and not paying much attention, the officers that have been charged were black, the victim was black. Just having representation is not going to bring police reform, correct?
Yeah, this really shines a light on the poverty and hollowness of the purely representational approach to social and racial justice, right? Because what we've seen is that when people put on that blue uniform, that identity seems to drown out all the other identities that they came to that blue uniform with, and its underlying logic takes hold. And so yes, it seems anomalous to some that we could call it racism if it's perpetrated by Black officers. How can that be anti-Black bias? It can be on a couple levels. Number one, Black people have a lot of anti-Black bias too toward other Black folk. That is established in studies, unconscious bias, good and bad here, a lot of ways that there can be anti-Black bias within Black folk. And then number two, of course, is systemic bias, right? If you locate police in certain neighborhoods, you tell them they can make pretextual stops that really kind of violate the Fourth Amendment. It says, I don't have a probable cause to pull you over. All I have is a hunch. But if I find a crack on your taillight, that can be a pretext for pulling you over, and I can practice stop and frisk on wheels, right? Those kind of systemic factors are also part of what make it kind of structural racism, because you don't see that happening in Beverly Hills. You see it happening in South Central where I'm living.
Well, son, we talk about the concept of defunding or changing the budgeting process or bringing in social workers to respond to mental health calls. There's a number of efforts that have been put forward to try and reduce police violence against citizens, against their bosses, if you will. Yet we still, as you point out, and we see issues like this continue to happen. We're not going to abolish the police or defund the police anytime soon. So what are steps that people should be calling for, both on the local level and on the federal level, to try and have a police force that is more guardian than warrior?
Yeah, I think it begins with really addressing some of the underlying issues, making sure that there is funding. The reason that this unit exists is to interact with high crime areas, so-called high crime areas, or engage with people who are engaged in gang violence. But no matter how you configure a special tactical unit, the tactics and strategies that they are going to use are ultra-militarized, and they are an occupying force in a community. What really needs to happen is making an investment in the underlying issues. People are struggling with substance use disorder and mental health issues, and there's trauma that people are experiencing, and there's study and research that shows that when you address those issues, disruption and crime in communities go down. It's not policing that really has an impact on crime. Less than 25% of crimes that are reported are solved by the police. Police spend less than 10% of their time actually dealing with crime. And then when you layer on top of that, again, race, regardless of the race of the officers, as the professor pointed out, it gets compounded, and you see acts of violence like this.
Professor, I'm always fascinated when I talk to law enforcement and I talk about traffic stops and talk about dealing with people who are in cars. And they often tell me how dangerous those stops are. And I remember I asked one officer, well, is it dangerous because you think it's dangerous and therefore it makes it more dangerous? Or is it dangerous because of the millions of traffic stops that happen across the country with no incident? You still think that there's something dangerous that's in the car. And obviously, with race putting another layer of bias on how they're going to approach. Are these conversations that we're having right now, do these happen in police departments at all?
Yeah, I'm a member of a group called Law Enforcement Action Partnership, which includes chiefs of police, captains, all the way down to rank and file, officers who are concerned about good policy so that police aren't given bad policy and, unnecessary reservoirs of resentment aren't generated from them having to enforce bad policy. And so absolutely, a lot of times here, what you're talking about is efforts to, kind of solve social problems by putting in police rather than addressing the underlying problems themselves. And when you ask about what are some of the solutions, we're not going to abolish the police. Absolutely, we're not going to abolish the police. We know that, right? But what we can do is unbundle the police. What we can do is take police out of traffic enforcement stops. The chief of police in this particular department said that they couldn't find any traffic infraction that Mr. Nichols was guilty of. Right, so this was really a purely pretextual stop. In studies that we've seen, the traffic fatalities don't necessarily go down when police are taken out of traffic enforcement. So we're not made safer by having police in these stops. What all it seems to do is help provide, fishing expeditions so the police can look for drugs and guns. Well, the war on drugs, folks, we realized that was a failure. I hope we're not continuing to use police for that. And the drugs and the guns, we have 380, 400 million in the country. You get 5 or 10 over a weekend. You're telling us we made a dent in guns by pulling over all of these folks. So we need to rethink about the footprint of policing itself, and then channel that energy, those police resources to solving crime. You know, that's what people really want, violent crimes to be solved. But when you're chasing turnstile jumpers and, you know, doing quality of life kind of stuff, you're not focusing your resources on the kind of crime solving that people really want their police departments to do.
Rahsaan, you were part of the team that was behind what a difference a DA makes, and certainly your run for district attorney. Is the changes that we are seeing, the quote-unquote, and I'm using finger quotes here, progressive DAs across the country, some who are not doing well, but I would offer it's not because of their policies that they're not doing well. Is the progressive DA, is that something that's still taking steam as we move into another election season?
Oh, you hit a sore spot for me, Sue.
I'm sorry. Too soon?
No,
Too
no,
soon?
it's fine. But no, it's not too soon. I think the conversation has shifted and eyes are on district attorneys. People are paying attention to what they're actually doing. I think it is important that the district attorney made swift decision to charge these officers, potentially indict them for very serious crimes. So that's something that has changed, whereas before there was an allegiance and an alignment with law enforcement, and district attorneys' offices would say, well, we need to investigate and get all the information that we possibly can before making a decision, and whether or not the officer felt that their life was in danger, that there was a threat to the community, informs their decision whether or not to prosecute. This was clearly nothing but unbridled battery and an assault on this individual, and they were punishing him for something that seemed very personal and unrelated to any violation of the law. And so I think it is important that there are so-called progressive district attorneys in positions to make these decisions, and the help of video evidence makes it more so that they'll pursue it.
Professor, just as we finish up here, I was struck also by how many different commands these officers gave that were made compliance impossible by almost anyone. Is this a teachable moment? Also, the idea that by giving commands that someone's already complied with kind of covers the fact that you've got a camera on in case that it's not being seen. Is this sort of evidence to citizens going to help people rise up and say we need reform?
Well, perhaps, but we've seen a lot of stuff like this before. You know, these body cams were on, but if we didn't have that higher up camera, we might not be having this conversation. Also, if Nichols hadn't died, we might not be having this conversation. These kinds of things go on a lot of times without there being these kinds of consequences. It seems that at the end of the day that, you know, all the reforms, through a process of elimination, we realize reforms aren't going to really minimize the harm. The harm is going to come from minimizing the contacts between our violence workers on the one hand and members of stereotype groups on the other.
Professor Jody David Armour and Rahsaan Hall, thank you so much for joining me, gentlemen. I appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, it's a question I'm sure we'd all like to know the answer to. What is the key to living a happy life? And it's been the focus of a Harvard study of adult development for more than 80 years now. It first began in 1938 and has since included 3 generations and more than 1,300 descendants of the original participants. And now, the current leaders of the study believe they've found the common denominator behind happiness. Joining me is Dr. Robert Waldinger. He's the studies director and a clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Marc Schulz. He is the associate director as well as a professor of psychology at Bryn Mawr College. They are also the co-authors of the new book, The Good Life, Lessons from the World's Longest Scientific Study of Happiness. So, you weren't there at the beginning.
No.
I'm
not that well preserved.
Who can tell me how the study was set up? Who's best to do that?
Probably me.
All right, so talk to me about who these people were, how you got them, and what, you know, for us to understand what the methodology of the study was.
These studies started in 1938. One started at Harvard College, a group of sophomores, 19 years old, It was a study of how young men moved into young adulthood, and the other was a study of inner city Boston boys from some of the most troubled and disadvantaged families. And that was a study of how some kids who were born with so much disadvantage were able to stay on good developmental paths and stay out of trouble.
You know, one of the things, Mark, in reading about the study and looking at some of the articles about it that I found fascinating was the compliance, as I think you say in your business, on how many people decided to stay filling out the survey, when they decided not to answer the questions, some of the things that they added on the side. How would you rate this compliance success, and what did you learn by the parts that people didn't comply with?
Yeah, it's remarkable because the study has taken place over 85 years, and across that time, 84% of the participants have continued to participate, which is a remarkable compliance rate, as we say. So we're really pleased. Folks have been very committed to this study, but that doesn't mean that they answer every question. So this is a study that was really interested in the lived firsthand experience of participants. So we had regular interviews, but we also had lots of traditional questionnaires, and many of our participants would write comments on the side saying, you need to ask this in a different way, or here's the question you should be asking. And sometimes they would skip questions. And the skipping of questions is interesting in a study where we're able to track them because we could always go back and to ask them during the interview. Many of the questions folks skipped often were challenging questions about their greatest fears or a challenge that they had in their lives. So there were probably reasons why people skipped them over the years.
And Bob, one of the things that, I think we should say up front, this was 1938, so it wasn't as if they were seeking out a diverse group of people, women, minority members also. I mean, it was diverse, I think, that they were looking for young men who were having a tough time economically. That was the diversity then.
Well, and also a lot of immigrant families, families from the Middle East as well as Eastern and Western Europe. And then we expanded, and then we brought in women in both generations.
And you're able to extrapolate from the original data and the additional folks that joined, feel confident that what you've come out with is directionally good advice.
Well, and the way we do that is by making sure that our study alone isn't what we rely on, that we bring in lots of other studies. And if other studies point to the same findings, then we can have confidence in what we've found.
All right, so we've done a big build-up here. We've talked about how you've done it, who participated in it, and Mark, for the $1 million answer, how can I be happier?
So the answer is really simple. When we look at our study and across these hundreds of other studies, what we find are relationships keep us happier and healthier throughout our lifespan. It's as simple a message as that. And it's all kinds of relationships, not just the person who you may spend the most time with, but it's your friends, it's relatives, it's people you work with, people in your neighborhood. It's all kinds of relationships are important.
And being happy isn't just about, feeling good about myself. There are some real strong connections between my health and my happiness.
Absolutely. It works both ways, that being happy and having good relationships keeps us healthier, but also being healthier means we have the energy to reach out and stay connected to people. So it's really a two-way street.
Mark, one of the things, I'm 61 now, and now I've seen a few kids grow up, right? And from birth to adulthood, some of them even longer. And I often say to some people, I feel like at 6 months, I kind of know who they're going to be. Right? I don't know which way they're going to go, but I kind of like, oh, you're acting the same way now at 35 that you did when I met you when you were 6 months old. And in this study, you sort of, you accommodate for that myself, for example, I'm either an introverted extrovert or an extroverted introvert. I don't know which, but I'm not always happy when I'm with people, but I feel happy when I know I'm connected to people. And so if you're watching at home and you think, like Sally Field recently said on the press tour for their movie, I don't really like people, but it doesn't mean she's not connected to people, right?
Well, I think we do come in different flavors, as you're suggesting, and some of us thrive when we're with lots of people, and some of us need it to be a little quieter, and maybe it's smaller numbers of connections that are important to us, but we all need connections. So the trick is figuring out the places where you thrive the best. It may not be at a big party if you're on the more introverted side, but across the spectrum, introversion to extroversion, lots of other flavors we come in, people thrive when they have those connections with others. That's the critical piece. The way in which we do it may differ depending on who we are.
You know, and one of the things we found, and we think is true for everybody, is whether you're shy or a party animal, that all of us need one relationship at least where we feel like the person would really be there whenever we needed them. At one point, we asked our original participants, who could you call in the middle of the night if you were sick or scared? List everybody. And most of them could list people, but some people couldn't list anybody. So we believe that no matter who you are, you need at least one or two of those kinds of relationships in your life.
My question is, will you meet me at the corner with a bag of $2,000 in unmarked bills and not ask any questions?
Oh, okay.
Just a little different take on that. But as you said, we come in all flavors. Marc, talk to me, too, about this epidemic of loneliness that we're having. And I'm going to ask you, Doctor, to weigh in as this as well. I mean, we're at a moment right now where almost anybody I ever met in my life, I can connect with, right? I can search them. I can find my kindergartner friend that I remember her name, but I don't know where she went. I could reach out to her. I can email her. I can text her. I can send her a TikTok of my family dancing. Yet with all of this connectivity, we're seeing these numbers of loneliness climb up. What's the disconnect between this connectivity and loneliness?
It's such an important question. So, you know, I would say there are forces at work that have been building for decades here that have made us more geographically isolated from each other. We're a very mobile society, so many of us have moved, oftentimes for jobs or relationships, away from where we grew up. So we're distant from our families and maybe from our school friends that we grew up with. And then we have these technologies that you've talked about that have great promise and can connect us in really important ways. But I think it's a balancing act for us as individuals and for society. The balance is between the sort of quick jolt that we get from a lovely text from a friend that says, I'm thinking about you, or something reminded me of you. And the difference between that and a kind of sustained connection that we might have, often through technology, it could be through Zoom, but it's different than the connections that we have in real time, whether it's virtually mediated through Zoom or interactions in the same room. So I think we're thirsting for those kinds of connections, and we're distracted. These technologies often distract us from the presence of other people, so our attention is distracted even when we're with people. So I think it's a challenge in modern life, and the numbers of people that feel lonely are quite extraordinary. It's 20 to 40% of adults in the U.S. report being lonely. So this is a major challenge, and it has significant consequences for our health. So it's a public health challenge of note.
And we certainly saw that impact during the COVID stay-at-home orders, where folks who had thriving social lives or a connected person were denied that, and it had dire consequences.
Yes, but as Marc says, it was on the rise before COVID, this loneliness and disconnection. And the difficulty is that the culture seems to prioritize other things, individualism, intense focus on work. And so what we see is a decline for decades, actually, in how much we invest in other people and in our communities. And so the question is, are there ways that we could structure our lives and our communities to reverse that trend?
To lead to that, not only on a public health area, but in an individual way, in the Atlantic article that features the study, you talk about an individual, a man who's, you changed his name to protect his identity. This survey required some self-reflection. And some of the questions asked of people, this man lived a very isolated life, even though he began the study with family and a sister and a wife. And the questions, when asked of him, he seemed surprised when you asked him, well, how's your sister? How's your wife? Do we need to do more self-reflection to really audit ourselves to see how we can become more happier?
Well, that's what we talk about in the book, actually, that each of us can reflect. What am I getting from my relationships? Different things, fun and material help and confidants and all that. And then what would I like more of? And is there a way to get more of that from the relationships I have, or to develop new relationships?
Professor, talk to me if there's 5 things that someone watching can do to try and take steps to increase their happiness. I mean, we're living in, as everyone always is, we're living in times that it's difficult to be happy sometimes just looking at the news. But your personal happiness is almost a separate, to me at least, is a separate thing from the environmental happiness. What can some people do just to try and take some steps forward?
Yeah, there are some important things I think we can all do. So part of it is really leaning into our connections, thinking about those folks, as Bob suggested, that are important in our life, that are meaningful. Let them know that that's important, and also make it your intention to spend more time with them. So I've been trying to make it a habit recently of not just saying, let's get together soon, but let's set a date that's in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever our time can allow. So really identifying those people, letting them know they're important, setting those dates are really important. Doing activities are another really important source, particularly for people who are looking to develop new relationships, that we develop friendships by repeated contact with people, and doing things side by side generates a connection that can build into a friendship. Really important, particularly for folks that are in transitions in a new community, retiring, to make those kinds of new friends. So those are a bunch of things that people can do, but it's really being intentional. We talk about it as social fitness, and we want folks to think about this just like they do going to the gym, to be really intentional and to work on strengthening those social muscles.
A little harder for men than it is for women.
It is, but men are prioritizing relationships more and more, and what we find is that they just relate to each other somewhat differently than women. But the research says relationships are really important to men too. And if I could just add to what Marc is saying, that you know, these efforts that Marc's talking about, to be intentional, they could be tiny. So people could be listening to us right now and think, who do I miss? Who would I like to connect with? And then just send them a text or send them a message saying, I was just thinking of you and wanted to say hi, and just see what you get back. And if we do that regularly, lots of things come our way.
The book, again, is The Good Life, Lessons from the World's Longest Scientific Study of Happiness. Dr. Robert Waldinger and Marc Schulz, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
That's it for tonight, but come back tomorrow. We'll get an update on the state's new community behavioral health centers, plus a new Frontline documentary digs into Vladimir Putin's relationships and clashes with every U.S. president, from Clinton to Biden. That and more tomorrow at 7. I'm Sue O'Connell. Thanks for watching. Good night.
Next time on